The usual disclaimers. Whatever remarks I make today are my own. I don't represent the University of Idaho, the School of Journalism, my colleagues, my bosses. So these are my own thoughts and my own ideas, and I should be held fully responsible for them, and no one else should ever have to take the blame. So, thank you, Murph, and thanks for letting me come back one more time.
Our pleasure.
One of these days we'll do a best hits or something. And if any of you feel that the need to update the score of the World Series, just jump right in. That's okay. I don't mind. So let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment and what's happening with the First Amendment, which is frightening. At the end of 2016, so not quite a year ago, according to the most recent Committee to Protect Journalists report, 260 journalists were imprisoned worldwide. And we know that number has grown in 2017. We're probably going to be pushing somewhere close to 300 by the end of this year. Now, nearly all of those journalists were imprisoned by their governments because they distributed in print, online, in broadcasts, social media. They distributed information and ideas that the state, their state, considered dangerous. In legal terms, the journalists were jailed for something that we would call seditious libel. Seditious libel. Publishing information the state considers harmful to its interests or that defames the government and its leaders. To this point, no journalist is jailed in the United States, though I still believe, as I said the last time I was here, that President Trump's campaign against fake news may take us in that direction yet. But American journalists cannot be prosecuted for seditious libel. Cannot be. That crime no longer exists in American law, thankfully. And to understand why, you have to really go back to the beginnings of the First Amendment, understand its origins, its application in modern American society. And to do that, we have to take just a very quick trip back to the colonial era, in fact, decades before the founding. And then, after we've taken that little side trip, we can talk about the way that the freedoms of speech and press and expression that were bequeathed to us by the founders, we can understand the current existential threat to those freedoms and to the First Amendment. So first, I want to reference a journalistic hero, John Peter Zenger. Some of you may remember Zenger from your own studies. In the pantheon of American press heroes, he's kind of an odd figure, certainly an odd place to start in a discussion of the First Amendment. He was a New Yorker, a colonial resident of New York, but he was Dutch, and so he was more closely aligned with the old New Amsterdam, New York, before the Dutch turned it over to the British. In 1734, he was publisher of a pro-Dutch newspaper in New York, in the city, and he published material that was highly critical of the British royal governor of the colony, Governor William Canby. And William Canby did not like what John Peter Zenger published. In those days, to publish a newspaper or a pamphlet or a booklet, you could only publish under the authority of the Crown. Meant you had to have a stamp on your publication saying that it had been authorized by the Crown. You had to pay a ridiculously high usurious tax. And if you published anything the Crown didn't like, you could lose, well, you could lose your freedom. So Zenger was arrested on charges of seditious libel. His work had defamed William Canby and had held Canby and the royal government of New York up to public ridicule and contempt. And he was imprisoned. Eventually, he served a full 9 months. And as I tell my students, while he's in prison, his wife publishes his newspaper. She becomes the first female publisher in the colonies, which is pretty cool, I think. Anna Zenger. Anyway, in court, he's defended by a colonial lawyer named Andrew Hamilton, a name that we don't much remember anymore. And the trial's outcome is predetermined. All the Crown has to prove is that Zenger published the material, that he's responsible for it. That's all they have to prove. And if they can prove that, then he's guilty of seditious libel and he can be jailed indefinitely. But Hamilton, who is an early patriot, takes this thing in a whole different direction. He argues before the colonial jury that mere publication is not sufficient for a conviction. It's not enough. If the material published was true, there could be no seditious libel. That was his argument to the jury. Citizens, he said, have a right to criticize their leaders. That was his argument. And if the criticism is based on fact, then there is no seditious libel. And the colonial jury agreed. Now, that's a revolutionary thing they did because they overturned the British common law of the time. They said to the British authorities that common law doesn't apply here. We in the colonies have a right to criticize our leaders. And in doing that, they established truth, not just as a defense for seditious libel, but that notion of truth as a defense against all forms of libel becomes enshrined first at the colonial level and then becomes part of the foundation for the founders in the First Amendment. And it's enshrined in legislative and case law to this very day. Libel law says truth is an absolute defense. Now, the notion of seditious libel, which Hamilton dealt a blow, was essentially buried then by the First Amendment, James Madison's great triumph. There are not too many things that I get emotional about. I'm a cynical, old-fart journalist who likes to think I've seen it all and mostly leaves me pretty much cold. But I still get a chill when I read or teach the First Amendment. At the time of its writing, freedoms of speech, the press, religion, and assembly, they were not protected by law anywhere else in the world. Never in human history had those elements been protected by law, by the state, and guaranteed by the state. It was unprecedented in human history then, and it's still unique in the world. There's nothing like it anywhere else. Madison understood that First Amendment freedoms would lead to abuses. That was inevitable. That could include defamation of the government and its leaders. But occasional abuses, he said, were a small price to pay for freedom of expression. Now, the founders, Madison, those behind the Bill of Rights, they had a conception of speech and press freedom, but it was imperfect. We know this, that the Constitution was imperfect, the Declaration was imperfect, the Bill of Rights was imperfect, and we also know that the Bill of Rights, none of them is actually absolute. They're always open to interpretation by the courts based on the context of the times. Our friends who support absolute interpretation of the Second Amendment don't understand that, but most of us understand that there is flexibility in these amendments. And so in practice, the First Amendment was, if not ignored, certainly observed in the breach for a good chunk of our history. To his everlasting shame, John Adams, one of the founders, second president of the United States, he signs the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and subsequently jailed dozens of publishers, editors, critical of his policies. Thomas Jefferson, who comes next in line, third president, succeeds in repealing those acts, but his relationship with Adams, close relationship, is broken forever, at least until their deathbeds. And then we have to remember that the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, did not apply to the states initially. Versions of First Amendment protections, press, assembly, religion, find their way into some state constitutions, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, but they were the exception to the rule. The perception was that the Constitution and Bill of Rights applied to federal action, not state or local action. So, for example, in the South, there were no First Amendment protections in the build-up to the Civil War. If you were a publisher advocating the abolition of slavery, you could be arrested and hung for inciting slave rebellion. The Civil War and the post-war amendments changed that, but no First Amendment protections at the state and local level until after the war. And then finally, so this little diversion through history, we have the First World War, World War I. 1918, Congress passes the Sedition Act of 1918. Okay? The act does not restore seditious libel. So the act of defaming, ridiculing, holding up to contempt public officials in government, that's not made illegal by the Sedition Act of 1918. What the act does say is that if you publish or speak material that poses an imminent, clear and present danger to the security of the country in time of war, it's a war act. You can be held accountable. That can be a criminal act. And the Supreme Court says that's okay. Time of war changes everything. And so the Sedition Act of 1918 remains on the books. And every once in a while you hear somebody invoke that act. In the recent years it's been Representative King of New York who's wanted to apply the Sedition Act to journalists, mostly editors at the New York Times and the Washington Post, who printed information from Edward Snowden, the NSA revelations, or the WikiLeaks revelation. But since World War I, there have been incredibly few prosecutions, and in contemporary times, no convictions on the Sedition Act. But it's still there. It's still there to be used. So.